It began with a crash. Not just the gentle, almost artistic descent of Oceanic Flight 815 onto a beach that looked suspiciously like Hawaii, but the crash of expectations, the implosion of narrative coherence. Lost, the show that promised us answers, the television event that had us scribbling notes like deranged detectives, finally reached its 6th season. This was meant to be the grand finale, the moment where all the disparate threads, the numbers, the polar bears, the smoke monster, the incessant daddy issues, would be woven into a magnificent tapestry of understanding. Instead, we got something akin to a toddler's macaroni art project, glued together with existential dread and a whole lot of hugging. It was a beautiful disaster, a glorious train wreck we couldn't look away from. Let's get the conclusion out of the way immediately, because unlike the show's writers, I believe in delivering a payoff. They were not dead the whole time, well, not until the very end anyway. The final season introduced a parallel reality, the Flash Sideways, which turned out to be a sort of spiritual waiting room, a purgatory where our beloved characters had to find each other to move on. This reveal was delivered with the subtlety of a polar bear trying to operate a vending machine. It retroactively reframed the entire season's B-plot as a long, drawn-out therapy session for ghosts. It was a bold choice, I suppose, in the same way that serving soup with a fork is a bold choice. It's memorable, but ultimately you just end up with a wet table and a profound sense of disappointment. The sheer audacity of Season 6 is something to behold. It took 6 years of meticulously built mystery and decided the most satisfying conclusion was to say the real treasure was the friends we made along the way. Imagine spending a decade excavating a mysterious Egyptian tomb, deciphering hieroglyphs about an ancient curse, only to find a sarcophagus filled with a note that says, "Hope you had fun." That was Lost Season 6. It was less of a story and more of a philosophical prank. It answered the big questions with even bigger, more confusing questions, leaving its audience in a state of bewildered contemplation, wondering if perhaps they were the ones who needed to let go and move on. The problem wasn't the ending itself, but the journey there. The season felt like a fever dream, scripted by a philosophy student who just discovered caffeine and nihilism in the same week. We were promised a battle between good and evil, a final confrontation for the soul of the island. What we got was a series of slow, ponderous conversations about faith, destiny, and the importance of remembering that time you shared a chocolate bar with a con man. The stakes, once so high they could give you vertigo, were lowered to the emotional equivalent of a group hug. It was a finale that aimed for profundity, but landed squarely in the realm of the bizarre. The Flash Sideways. Oh, the Flash Sideways. This narrative device was introduced as the final evolution of the show's storytelling gimmick, moving on from flashbacks and flash-forwards to a whole new temporal plane. In this alternate reality, Oceanic 815 never crashed. Jack was a dad, Sawyer was a cop, and Ben Linus was a sad history teacher. For weeks, we were led to believe this was the result of the hydrogen bomb detonation at the end of Season 5, a tangible what-if scenario. This was a clever misdirection, a classic lost trick. The only problem is that the eventual reveal made all of it feel utterly pointless from a plot perspective. It was like watching a magician spend 20 minutes setting up an elaborate trick, only for him to pull a slightly wilted flower from his sleeve. Imagine buying a state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line toaster. It has Bluetooth, a touchscreen, and it promises to make the perfect slice of toast every single time. You spend weeks marveling at its features, debating the optimal settings for sourdough versus rye. Then, on the final day, the manual informs you that the device doesn't actually toast bread. It's a bread-warming emotional support device, and its true purpose is to help you appreciate the memory of good toast. That's the Flash Sideways. We invested in a plotline about a parallel universe, only to be told it was a metaphorical waiting room for souls. The narrative stakes dissolved into a puff of sentimental smoke, leaving us with a very expensive, non-functional toaster. The execution was also questionable. We spent half of the final season watching alternate reality versions of our characters live out mundane lives, occasionally experiencing a flicker of déjà vu. Jack has a son with a weird haircut. Locke is still in a wheelchair, but has a loving relationship with Helen. It was all very touching, but it ground the main island plot to a screeching halt. Just as the man in black was about to do something menacing, we'd cut away to Kate Austen on the run from the law again, as if the writers had a contractual obligation to show her escaping from something at least once per episode. It was a bizarre pacing choice that felt less like intentional storytelling and more like someone was switching channels between a high-concept fantasy epic and a low-budget soap opera. Ultimately, the Flash Sideways universe was a giant allegorical cul-de-sac. It didn't affect the island plot, and the island plot didn't affect it. They were two separate shows running in parallel, one about a magic island and the other about group therapy in the afterlife. The grand reveal that tied them together felt less like a clever twist and more like a hastily written excuse for why we'd spent so much time watching Sawyer and Miles be buddy cops. It was a narrative dead end, a beautifully shot, wonderfully acted exploration of themes that had very little to do with the 6 years of polar bears and hatches that came before it. It was, in short, a bit of a swindle. Lost built its reputation on mysteries. It was a puzzle box, a labyrinth of unanswered questions that fueled 1,000 fan theories and kept us tuning in week after week. What are the numbers? Why are there polar bears in the tropics? Who built the four-toed statue? Season 6 was supposed to be the answer key. The showrunners, Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse, promised us that the final season would provide resolutions. This turned out to be true in the same way that a politician's promise to lower taxes is true. It sounds good in theory, but the reality is far more complicated and involves a lot of fine print you didn't see coming. The show did answer some questions, to be fair. We found out the smoke monster was the man in black, trapped in smoke form. We learned the numbers corresponded to the final candidates to replace Jacob. But for every answer we received, 10 more questions sprang up in its place. It was like trying to plug a leak on a sinking ship with chewing gum. We learned about Jacob and his brother, but who was their mother? Where did she come from? Why did she have a magical wine bottle and an obsession with convoluted rules? The show treated its own lore with the casual disinterest of a cat knocking things off a shelf. It just didn't seem to care. This approach to answers is best exemplified by the infamous whispers in the jungle. For 6 seasons we heard them, creepy, disembodied voices that hinted at a supernatural presence. Fans speculated they were the ghosts of the Black Rock crew, or perhaps the others using some weird jungle acoustics. The answer, revealed in a throwaway line, was that they were the lingering spirits of the dead who couldn't move on. That's it. It was the most mundane, spiritually generic explanation possible. It was like finding out the monster under your bed is just an unresolved tax issue. The mystery was far more compelling than the bland, unsatisfying answer. Ultimately, the show decided that the why was less important than the who. It prioritized character-driven, emotional resolutions over logical, plot-driven ones. This is a valid artistic choice, but it felt like a betrayal to the audience that had spent years treating the show like a cryptic crossword puzzle. We were the nerds who catalogued every Dharma logo and translated every Latin phrase, only to be told that none of it really mattered. The showrunners essentially looked us in the eye and said the real mystery was about people, not polar bears. And while that's a lovely sentiment, it doesn't explain the polar bears. Let us speak of the polar bear. For a brief, glorious time in the mid-2000s, the polar bear was the symbol of Lost's beautiful absurdity. A magnificent Arctic predator found inexplicably on a tropical island. It was the ultimate WTF moment, a promise of deep, strange lore to come. We saw them in Dharma Initiative cages, and we even saw their skeletons in the Tunisian desert. The existence of these bears demanded an explanation. It was a narrative Chekhov's gun, and we all waited for it to be fired. In Season 6, the gun finally went off, but it just fired a little flag that said, bang. The explanation was that Dharma brought them there for experiments with electromagnetism and adaptation. This explanation is, on the surface, perfectly logical. The Dharma Initiative was a group of eccentric scientists doing weird things, so of course they brought polar bears to a tropical island. It makes a certain kind of sense. But it's also the most boring explanation imaginable. It's like being told the monolith from 2001. A space odyssey was just a leftover piece of scaffolding. The magic of the polar bear wasn't in its scientific origin, it was in its sheer, beautiful weirdness. By explaining it away with a mundane piece of pseudoscience, the show stripped one of its most potent symbols of its power. The mystery was simply better than the solution. This brings us back to the whispers. As previously mentioned, the answer was ghosts. This is a classic example of what I call narrative deflation. The showrunners took a balloon full of suspense and slowly let the air out until it was just a limp piece of rubber on the floor. For years, the whispers were a source of genuine tension. They were creepy, they were omnipresent, and they suggested a complex supernatural ecosystem on the island. Were they the voices of the island itself? A psychic projection from the smoke monster? The answer, it's just some sad ghosts, is so profoundly uninspired it borders on comedy. It's the horror movie equivalent of the monster being a man in a cheap rubber suit. This pattern of underwhelming answers became the hallmark of the final season. It felt as though the writers had created a world so dense with mystery that they couldn't possibly explain it all in a satisfying way, so they just didn't. They chose the path of least resistance, offering simple, often spiritual explanations for complex, seemingly scientific phenomena. The polar bears were for science, the whispers were ghosts, the statue was just a statue. It was a grand shrug of the shoulders, a televised admission that they had written themselves into a corner, and the only way out was to burn the map and hope nobody noticed. But we noticed. Oh, we noticed. At the heart of Season 6 lies the story of Jacob and his brother, the Man in Black. This was meant to be the grand mythological conflict that underpinned the entire series. The ultimate battle of good versus evil, faith versus science, light versus dark. We were finally introduced to these two ancient godlike beings who had been using the survivors of Oceanic 815 as pawns in their cosmic chess game. The episode dedicated to their origin story across the sea was a bold move. It took us back to ancient times, showed us their strange upbringing with their cryptic mother, and explained how one became the island's protector and the other became a malevolent cloud of smoke. The problem is that this epic conflict, when you boil it down, was essentially a temper tantrum that had lasted for 2,000 years. The Man in Black wanted to leave the island. Jacob, at the behest of their frankly terrible mother, wouldn't let him. One thing led to another. Someone got thrown into a magic light cave, and suddenly we have a smoke monster and an eternal feud. It reframed the entire show, not as a battle for the fate of humanity, but as a particularly nasty case of sibling rivalry. I mean, it was like finding out that the Trojan War was really just about who got the last biscuit at tea time. It dramatically lowered the stakes. The characters themselves were also a bit thin. Jacob was presented as the embodiment of good, but his methods were questionable at best. He manipulated people's lives, brought them to a dangerous island against their will, and generally sat around looking vaguely disappointed in everyone. He was less a benevolent deity and more of a cosmic middle manager who enjoyed being cryptic. The Man in Black, on the other hand, was the villain. He was manipulative, murderous, and had a penchant for body snatching. And yet his motivation was surprisingly relatable. He just wanted to go home. You almost found yourself rooting for the smoke monster, if only so he would stop complaining. This backstory, while providing some answers, also managed to demystify the island. For years, the island was a character in itself, a place of magic, science, and unknowable power. Across the sea, reduced it to a cork, a magic cork in a magic hole that keeps evil from escaping. This is, without a doubt, one of the silliest MacGuffins in television history. The fate of the world rests on a big rock stopper. It turned a place of profound mystery into a piece of cosmic plumbing. The grand, epic struggle for the soul of the world was, in the end, about making sure nobody pulled the plug on the universe's bathtub. Lost was always, at its core, a character show. We fell in love with these flawed, broken people. We watched Jack Shepherd, the man of science, learn to embrace faith. We watched John Locke, the man of faith, become a tragic pawn. We watched Sawyer, the selfish conman, evolve into a reluctant hero. These arcs were the beating heart of the show. Season 6, however, had the unfortunate task of concluding these journeys, and it did so in the most bewildering way possible. It took our beloved characters and essentially split them in two, their physical selves on the island and their spiritual selves in the purgatorial flash sideways. On the island, the character arcs felt rushed and in some cases completely undone. Sawyer, after seasons of growth and learning to care for others, reverted to his selfish, cynical self for large parts of the season. His primary motivation became getting off the island, regardless of the consequences for everyone else. It was a regression that felt unearned, a cheap way to create conflict. Jack, meanwhile, completed his transformation into a man of faith so completely that he became a willing martyr, walking calmly towards his own demise. It was a fitting end for his character, perhaps, but it felt less like a choice and more like a foregone conclusion. Then there was the flash sideways. Here the characters were given a chance at a different life, one free from the trauma of the island. This is where the showrunners decided to land their emotional punches. We saw Locke reconcile with his father, Jack bond with his non-existent son, and Charlie help Claire give birth. These moments were designed to be cathartic, to give the characters the peace they never found in life. The problem is that these weren't really our characters. They were idealized, ghost-like versions of them, living out a fantasy. Their emotional breakthroughs, while touching, felt disconnected from the gritty, hard-won growth we'd witnessed on the island. The most egregious example of character assassination might be Ben Linus. For years, he was the show's greatest villain, a manipulative, brilliant, and deeply compelling antagonist. In the final season, he was reduced to a snivelling sidekick, first for the man in black and then for the heroes. His journey ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, as he chose to stay behind in the purgatory world to atone for his sins. It was a sad, pathetic end for a character who once held the entire island in the palm of his hand. It was a microcosm of the season's approach to its characters, sacrificed their established personalities for the sake of a tidy, sentimental conclusion. Let's be honest, Lost was never a show that relied heavily on blockbuster special effects. Its strengths were its writing, its characters, and its atmosphere. However, when it did dip its toe into the world of CGI, the results were often memorable. The smoke monster, in its early seasons, was a terrifying, unseen force, a collection of clicks, whirs, and violently shaking trees. It was a masterful use of sound design to create horror. By season 6, however, we saw Smokey in all his glory, and he looked like a column of poorly rendered black pixels from a mid-90s computer game. It was less ancient evil and more overzealous screensaver. The demystification of the smoke monster was a critical error. The more we saw of it, the less scary it became. When it was revealed to be the man in black, it gained a consciousness and a voice, which should have made it more terrifying. Instead, it just made it seem petulant. The monster that once inspired primal fear was now just a grumpy man trapped in a cloud, complaining about his brother. The visual effects did it no favours. Seeing this cloud of digital smoke chase our heroes through the jungle was often unintentionally hilarious, like watching a scene from a scary movie parody. This budgetary restraint, or perhaps questionable artistic choice, extended to other areas. The source, the magical heart of the island, was presented as a cave with some glowing water and a big rock in it. It looked like a set from a low-budget fantasy film from the 1980s. When Desmond pulled the cork, the light didn't go out with a cataclysmic explosion, but with a gentle fizzle. The entire set-piece, which was meant to be the climax of the island's mythology, felt strangely small and underwhelming. It lacked the scale and grandeur that 6 seasons of build-up had led us to expect. Even the submarine escape felt a bit cheap. The sequence was tense, for sure. But the explosion and subsequent flooding felt like standard action movie fare. It lacked the unique, otherworldly quality that defined Lost's best moments. Season 6 often felt visually grounded in a way that worked against its high-concept plot. It told us we were witnessing a battle for the fate of reality, but it showed us a group of people running around in Hawaii, occasionally being chased by a cloud of unconvincing CGI. The spectacle simply didn't match the stakes, and the result was a finale that felt smaller than the seasons that preceded it. Before we step into that church full of feelings, let's take a moment to remember why Lost became a cultural phenomenon in the first place. Because for all its unanswered questions and polar bear-shaped plot holes, the show was, at its heart, pure television magic. It began with that unforgettable plane crash, a visual and emotional gut punch that set the tone for everything that followed. Suddenly, we were stranded alongside the survivors, piecing together the mystery of the island and the strangers around us. Every week brought new surprises, a hatch buried in the jungle, numbers that seemed to control fate, and a button that had to be pushed every 108 minutes or else. Well, nobody really knew, but it was terrifying nonetheless. The characters were the real treasure. Jack, the reluctant leader with a hero complex. Kate, running from her past and towards an uncertain future. Sawyer, whose sarcasm was as thick as the jungle. Locke, desperate to believe the island was special because he needed to be special. Each survivor brought their own baggage, both literal and emotional. And we watched as they formed alliances, fell in love, betrayed each other and grew, sometimes in ways that surprised even themselves. Lost was a masterclass in cliffhangers. The hatch opening, the raft launch, the other's true nature, Michael's heartbreaking betrayal, and that moment when we realized we have to go back. The writers knew exactly how to keep us talking, theorizing and frantically refreshing message boards at 2 a.m. But it wasn't just about plot twists and puzzles. Lost was about connection. The flashbacks, and later, flash forwards and sideways, reminded us that everyone's story mattered. The show invited us to care deeply about a group of flawed, fascinating people, and to root for them as they faced monsters both real and metaphorical. And then there were the moments that stuck with us. Charlie's hand spelling "not Penny's boat" against the glass. Desmond's tearful "see you in another life, brother." Son and Jin's tragic farewell. Hurley's comic relief. And the simple act of Jack closing his eyes, his story ended where it began. For 6 seasons, Lost asked us to embrace mystery, to believe in destiny, and to invest in people who, like us, were just trying to find their way home. It was a show that made us laugh, cry, and yes, occasionally scream at our televisions. If the ending was divisive, it's only because the journey meant so much. That's the magic of Lost. It left us, for better or worse, utterly unable to let go. And so we arrive at the end. The final episode of Lost is perhaps one of the most divisive pieces of television ever created. It is an episode of 2 halves. On the island, we have the climactic rain-swept punch-up between Jack and the man in black in Locke's body. It's a brutal, muddy affair that ends with Kate shooting the villain and Jack kicking him off a cliff. It's a surprisingly conventional end to an unconventional show. Jack, mortally wounded, stumbles back to the bamboo forest where he first awoke, lies down with Vincent the dog, and closes his eye as the plane carrying his friends flies overhead. It's a poetic, circular ending for his physical journey, but that's only half the story. The other half takes place in the flash sideways purgatory. One by one, the characters awaken, remembering their lives on the island. These moments are played for maximum emotional impact, filled with tears, hugs, and swelling orchestral music. It all culminates in a church where the main cast gathers. Christian Shepherd, whose name was, it turns out, a bit of a clue, explains that this place is a construct they created so they could all find each other before moving on together. They were all dead, yes, but only in this specific timeline. The island was real, their journey was real, but this was the afterlife. The final scene of the characters sitting in the church pews, bathed in a warm white light, was a bold rejection of everything the mystery-obsessed fans wanted. It offered no answers about the island's deeper lore. It simply said that the journey was about these people finding connection and redemption. For many, this was a beautiful, moving conclusion. For others, it was a colossal cop-out. It was as if you ordered a steak and were served a slice of cake. The cake might be delicious, but it's not what you were promised for 6 years. It felt like the writers had abandoned their own plot in favour of a saccharine spiritual sermon. The ambiguity was the final nail in the coffin for many. What does moving on even mean? Where are they going? The show leaves it open to interpretation, which is another way of saying it doesn't have an answer. The finale prioritised emotion over explanation, catharsis over coherence. It was an ending designed to make you feel something rather than understand something. And in that, it succeeded. It made millions of people feel confused, angry, betrayed, and for a select few, profoundly satisfied. It was a finale that perfectly encapsulated the show itself. Ambitious, messy, brilliant, and ultimately, completely bonkers. So, what is the legacy of Lost, and specifically its chaotic final season? Years after the credits rolled on Jack's closing eye, the show occupies a strange place in our collective cultural memory. It is simultaneously remembered as one of the greatest television shows of all time, and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mystery box storytelling. It proved that you could tell a complex, long-form story on network television, but it also proved that if you write too many checks, you might not be able to cash them all at the end. The show's ambition was both its greatest strength and its ultimate downfall. Season 6, for all its flaws, is a fascinating piece of television. It's a document of what happens when a cultural phenomenon becomes too big to control. The writers were backed into a corner by years of their own cleverness, and they had to find a way out. Their solution, to pivot from a sci-fi mystery to a spiritual allegory, was clumsy and divisive, but it was also undeniably brave. They chose to tell the story they wanted to tell, even if it wasn't the story the audience was expecting. It was an act of artistic defiance that cemented the show's controversial reputation forever. We still talk about Lost today, not just because of its unanswered questions, but because of the conversation it created. It was one of the first true internet shows, a series that was debated, dissected, and theorized about in real time by a global community of fans. The disappointment many felt with the finale was a direct result of that intense investment. We cared so much because the show had made us care. The anger was a strange form of love. The chaos of Season 6 didn't erase the brilliance of what came before, but it did recontextualize it, turning a mystery into a parable. In the end, maybe the showrunners were right. Maybe the real treasure was the friends we made along the way, or at least the frantic forum posts we wrote at 3 a.m. trying to figure out the significance of a hieroglyph. Lost Season 6 was a beautiful, frustrating, unforgettable mess. It failed to answer our questions, but succeeded in making us feel something. It was a television show that tried to explain the meaning of life, death, and everything in between, and ended up just shrugging its shoulders and pointing towards a pretty sunset. And honestly, there's a certain kind of dark, existential humour in that which you just have to respect. Like the castaways, you keep returning, drawn by questions, theories, and a little bit of magic flickering from your screen. Maybe the real enigma isn't the island at all, but the curious soul watching from the other side. Until the next riddle calls, don't get lost out there.